So good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon on Wednesday. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to share my screen here. So for those of you who don't know me, this is Dr. Darvish, and I'm a Chief Medical Officer and founder of Holistic Medical Center and Holistic IV Lounge here in Bellevue, Washington. And we're talking about a few questions, actually. My intent is to answer a few questions today. One question is racism modifying our genes? The other question is, do our thoughts and emotions impact our health? And then, do we have the capacity to heal our DNA and our future generations? So these are really powerful and important questions, and I've been doing a lot of research lately on these topics since all this issues around racism has come to a head. And we're going to be using racism as an example, but really it relates to any one of us going through any kind of emotional trauma, stress, anything, whether we're going through it or we've been through it. So I do want to make sure that this is an open conversation, even though I've got you muted. If you would like to say something, please unmute yourself and make a comment, or you can wait till the very end and make a comment, or you can go to the bottom where it says chat and send me a chat, and I will try to respond to it as soon as I can. So create an open conversation. I also want to empower all of us to shift towards creating well-being, and this is one of the main reasons we're doing these webinars, especially this one, is to help us gain more knowledge. And I believe knowledge is power, and it allows us to become more aware and make shifts easier in our lives to create more well-being. And then we're trying to also understand the connection between our emotions and experiences and our thoughts and the way they impact our cells and our health. The other intention I have is for us to really understand the way our emotions and thoughts actually affect our genes and what impact they have for generations forward. So we'll be using racism, like I said earlier, as an example, and then we'll also be talking about this whole concept of epigenetics and what that means and how that relates to all of this, and then explore some avenues of how we can shift some of these things. So first of all, let's talk about racism. Just to define it or give some background information, racism and the terms race and racism have only been part of the English language for the past 500 years. And it was created out of this idea of privilege or superiority that was given to certain people of certain colors, and then the disadvantages that were given to people of color, namely the Black. And so over time, it became a social practice and a social reality as those with privileges became stronger, namely the white, and then those with the color skin became more disadvantaged. And this over time led to what we know now is called individual and structural racism. So over time, through education and conditioning and learning, the whites created a system where they were able to elevate their social, political, and economic status through structuring situations and environments that disadvantaged the Black or the people of color. And so racism is really, I believe, is a form of fallacy because it has no real basis in any kind of science or divine religion. It is really something that is created out of our minds, out of our imaginations, and then created a whole social setting out of that. And it really, if you think about it, it doesn't really serve any purpose. And it doesn't serve any one of us, either collectively or alone. And it, if anything, it causes more stress, mentally, emotionally, and causes disability of capacities on both parties. So the people, the Black who are disadvantaged or hurt and prevented from achieving their potential, and then the white are also hurting themselves and preventing themselves from achieving their potential. So that's what I believe. But let's deal with the science and look at the science about this fascinating stuff. So basically, epigenetics means that the environment and the environmental toxins and experiences that we are exposed to throughout our lifetime, from the time of preconception to current times, these toxins or environmental experiences have the capacity to turn on certain genes and then turn off other genes, and ultimately leads to disease. So it's like a switch that you can turn on certain lights and turn off other lights to turn on certain genes that will lead to certain diseases or will prevent other diseases. And this is what's called epigenetics. We know now that epigenetics can be inherited, so we can pick up some of these switches that have been turned on or off from our parents or our grandparents, but we can also pass it on to future generations. And what's so interesting is that epigenetics can be accumulative throughout generations. So what that means is that, let's say I, through certain experiences that I go through in my life, stressful experiences, emotional experiences, physical toxic experiences, that these will turn on certain switches. And then my children will take that on, take on now a mutation in that certain gene that has been turned on, and then they will go through their own experience and they will have other genes that are switched on and switched off. And so now they're getting not only my stuff, but their own stuff, and their risk for disease goes up. And then their grandchildren or my grandchildren will have even higher risk of disease if this continues without any one of us intervening to correct some of these. So it is accumulative throughout generations, but it can be consciously changed. And we're going to go through that, which is really powerful to know that even though we have been taken on, we have inherited some of these genes, these switches, mutations from our parents and grandparents, that we do have the capacity to turn some of them off and turn the ones that we need back on. So racism is a great example of epigenetics and how it results in disease risk and diseases, and how it's passed on to future generations. So racism is a psychosocial stress that leads to changes in health status and behavior, and then ultimately leads to health risks. And this is a studied, relatively recent study that looks at the racial discrimination and how it specifically is a psychosocial stresses that changes patterns of behavior and changes health risks. And then there's more research that's been going on even more recently, and identifying racism as a toxin because of the effects it has on our chemistry in our body, on our nervous system. So in these studies, they were looking at how racism promotes certain genes to be turned on or off that affects what's called the HPA axis. And the last few sessions of these webinars, and you're welcome to go back and listen to them on my website, drdarvish.com, we talk about specifically the HPA axis. It stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It is the main pathway, the main signals from the brain to basically our adrenals that respond to stress. And when people go through racism and experience racism, this HPA axis gets affected, and it secretes a lot of stress hormones and it causes burnout for some. And again, this is accumulative. So the stress response becomes accumulative, where it starts impacting and shifting our DNA, specifically mitochondria DNA. So mitochondria is our cell engine, and it gets shifted by the stress hormones when they go on for too long. And then that, we know, also passes on to our children. And we now know, and some of the studies, I think, next few slides will show how the children actually become less tolerant of stress. So if I'm the first one experiencing the stress and chronically, that changes the methylation of my DNA, and then that will ultimately pass on to the children, and they have a lot less stress tolerance. And we know specifically from these studies that racial discrimination does increase the disease risk in Blacks. I do want to point out just, and I'll mention again later, but all of these things that I'm talking about, even though the studies have been mainly done on African Americans and Blacks, that the whole concept of epigenetics and stress and the way it impacts our DNA and health is not limited to the Black population. It is limited to anybody who experiences any kind of stress, any form. We just use the Black racism because it is an extraordinary, extreme stress that has gone on for generations, and we've been able to study it that way. So epigenetics and health disparities, which basically means that there is a difference between those who perceive stress or perceive racism or are experiencing racism, and those who don't go through such intense stressors, that there is an increased risk for cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. So this is really powerful to know that it stems from just the perception of feeling racism coming at us or being racist towards somebody else. It goes both ways. What they also did was they went through looking at enslavement and the clinical manifestations of the enslavement problems and how it specifically shifted certain DNA or certain genetics in certain people, the biochemistry. So it's fascinating stuff because what they were able to link was that people who are suffering from chronic fatigue, they tend to have more hypomethylation of their immune system. I don't know what that question mark is, that's a typo, but they basically had their immune regulation or immune system become dysregulated. They were not able to fight infections because of the stressors that they experienced through enslavement. Concentration issues were problematic because, again, specifically it caused damage to what's called the phospholipids and the omega-3 fatty acids. So phospholipids, we know, are the fats that surround every cell, and they're extremely important for cellular function as well as our nervous system. And when people are going through such enslavement stress, there was damage to these areas that ultimately impacted the damage to the brain. They also saw weight changes happening, either weight gain or weight loss, and they related that to changes that was happening to that HPA axis, the stress signaling hormones, and the dysregulation of how the cortisol was being released. And then thoughts and behaviors of self-blaming or being pessimistic, self-critical, those were all related to shifts that were happening at what's called the oxytocin receptor gene. Oxytocin is that hormone that is high right after birthing a child that allows the mom and the baby to bond. And it's the hormone that we release in social interactions and wanting to be close to somebody else. And so when people went through these enslavement experiences, that they found that the oxytocin receptor was not as capable of it receiving that hormone, and thus people felt more alone, more depressed, and more self-critical. So this is all happening at the DNA level as well. So furthermore, more studies showing as to how this enslavement, as an example of epigenetics, increased the cortisol level, and that it actually caused, it was like a catalyst to creating more health conditions, including heart disease and diabetes, but also mood disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorders. Furthermore, the chronic food deprivation that these people went through further enhanced the trauma and further accentuated this stress response and the changes that happen at the DNA level. And then they saw that in the generations that were to come. This was a study that was looking at triple-negative breast cancer. So triple-negative breast cancer is a very aggressive form of breast cancer. And they looked at the white and the African-American woman here. And what they saw was that the African-American woman actually had a gene, a mutation of a gene TP53, specifically, if you really want to know, that drove the triple-negative cancer even more aggressive. This TP53 did not exist in the white females. And so they concluded that these changes at the mutation level were a result of racial discrimination and the change and the stressors that were causing mutation, leading to a feed to these cancers. What's also really interesting is that we see these stressors impact neurocognition. In other words, our memory, our cognition, our capacity to understand and learn, and then that in turn affected the whole nervous system, which affected the immune system. And they found that in people who have experienced chronic racism, that there is an increased risk of infections because of the immune system weakening in these people. And so here's one of those studies that looked at the white blood cells and how the white blood cells actually went towards more inflammatory white blood cells when there was racism experienced. So we see that racism causes an increased risk or increased stress hormones that affects our neuroendocrine, which means our nervous system and the hormone system specifically, but also our immune system, our metabolism, and our reproduction. And this leads to a whole array of chronic diseases and increases the risks for those diseases. So during development, when the brain is very, very sensitive to environmental changes, if the mother, for instance, is going through any kind of a stress response, that this will impact the structure of the brain, and specifically it will impact cognition and mood in children. So then when those babies are born, they're going to be much more moody, whether they're more aggressive or more depressed or stress intolerant as babies and as adolescents and as young adults. So this also, by the way, not only refers to the mothers, but also to the fathers and the stress that they may be going through preconception. Anybody have any questions so far? No? Okay. So stress promotes shifts, as we are learning, to the DNA and specifically to brain parts of the brain, especially what's called the limbic part of the brain. Now, the limbic part of the brain is right in the center between the right and left of the brain. It's in the bridge area of the brain, and it has to do with emotion. Okay, so when there's chronic stresses going on from preconception, during pregnancy, and it impacts the brain formation of the child, it will specifically affect all sorts of biochemical changes, specifically also what's called messenger RNA. And messenger RNA is one of those DNA, part of the DNA, you could say, a part of our genetics that is responsible for giving out messages, okay? And we're learning more and more that some of these messages can be regenerate, heal, rejuvenate, and then some messages could be that you've got to degenerate, you're not gonna grow as well, or you're gonna create more disease or malformation. So there's multiple messages that can be released, and a lot of it can be regulated by the emotional center in the brain. And that has a big tie-in with the way the stress hormones, that HPA, stress regulation, the cortisol, is regulated. And this was specifically studied in rats. And so what they saw was that the racism is affecting the brainstem and cognition, specifically in these areas of the brain. So prefrontal cortex is our top part of the brain that has to do with reasoning. So if a baby is being born into this world during a very stressful pregnancy of the mother or preconception, that baby is more likely to have stress intolerance and be more aggressive, or have more ADHD, or more depression, post-traumatic distress syndromes, depression, whatever, multiple different hormonal, neurological, emotional conditions as a result of the brain being damaged or not formed as well. And that also affects their learning and memory and their arousal and their capacity to tolerate and adapt to stress. What's also interesting is that they looked at racism, again, racism being a form of intense stress, and how that impacted the actual telomere. So this is a chromosome, and the telomeres are the caps at the end of the chromosome. The longer the cap, the slower the aging. And what they saw with people who have been going through these intense stressors is that the telomere starts shrinking. And to some extent with the Black community, that the telomeres will shrink 10 times faster than or 10 years faster, I should say, than the white population. And so Blacks tend to be about 10 years older than their age because of the stress that either they've experienced or they've inherited from previous generations. We know also that environmental exposures that we get from food and toxins, stress and trauma, those are also passed through generations. This is a study that looks at that specifically. And this is a very interesting study. They looked at these rats. So they gave the mother rats a lot of attention. They gave nourishment, good food, reduced stress, all of that good stuff. And this baby rat, or the mother rat, had good, what's called methylated DNA. And so the babies, when the babies were born, remember that oxytocin receptor was working, and so these babies really bonded well, and they had good behavior. Whereas the mothers who were not methylating well because of the stress that they had experienced through their lifetime or inherited, that they were less attentive to their children, they didn't have the oxytocin connection, and these children tend to be more depressed and less nurtured. And then they saw that what the mother was experiencing or having in terms of methylation in the DNA and the switches that were turned on and off, that it affected the eggs basically, and specifically the RNA and DNA and all the biochemical epigenetic modifications that was happening in the egg. And then when the babies were born, those babies also had certain developmental issues, especially in cognition and behavior. We also have learned that racism specifically increases cardiovascular risk, but it multiplies through generations. So in other words, it is accumulative through generations. So generation 1 may have some risk for heart disease, the next generation will have significantly higher, and then the third, the fourth, exponentially higher. And this is because, again, that racism specifically affects our hormones, our physiology, our cells, and that is passed on to generations, which is called transgenerational epigenetics. What's also interesting is when they looked at immigrants and the stress that the immigrants go through from just immigrating and the shifting from one country to the other. And if you think about it, all of us have been an immigrant, or generationally, ancestors have been an immigrant at some point. And so immigrants were 3 times more likely to have schizophrenia because of the stressors that they experienced during the immigration process. And the darker their skin, the higher the risk. And this was mainly because of the vitamin D receptors, which were affected by the stress response during immigration and the racism that they felt after they came here, as well as B12 complex, B complex and B12 levels specifically, in the way they're metabolized in the system, and then their DNA. So just the process of immigration affects all of this, which together will increase the risk of heart disease, diabetes, cancers, and multiple other physical, mental stressors. And again, they saw this transgenerationally. So I alluded to at the very beginning that stress does not only involve victims of racism and their transgenerationally, their offsprings, but it also involves the perpetrator and the stresses that they go through. So oftentimes when perpetrator creates or instigates some kind of a racism remark or attitude towards another, or physically attacks another, there is at some degree some either guilt or shame or remorse or some emotion that that perpetrator carries with themselves. And that emotion is again a chronic stress that starts affecting the DNA and our genetics. And this leads me to this whole concept of the vibration of emotions. This is a very fascinating area of psychotherapy and psychology, where if you look at some of the most negative emotions that we as humans have, namely shame, guilt, apathy, grief, and fear. And I would say that right now in the world, there is a lot of fear and there's a lot of grief, right? And with some of the chaos that's going on, there will be some guilt and some shame in those individuals and in those communities as well. But this causes a lot of suffering. Now, the more elevated emotions like acceptance, reason, love, joy, peace, and enlightenment, these have the highest frequencies of vibration. But what's also interesting is that as you come down this way, right, the cone contracts. And what that means is that we actually feel very small, very alone, very incapacitated, and very stuck when we are in these frequencies, these negative frequencies. And you can see that, especially I call it the acute phase of COVID-19, just a month or so ago, There was a lot of fear, and people felt really stuck, very, very stuck. But then as we are able to pull out of this and expand up here, you can see this cone really expands. And this is what I like to refer to as the vassal and our conscious having the capacity to take on more, to be able to create more, and to really experience the ultimate capacity and exercise the ultimate capacity that we as humans have. And so if we can get to a point where we are actually practicing love for the sake of love, joy for the absolute sake of joy, and peace for the sake of peace, all of this totally unconditional, and get ourselves to a point where we're enlightened, that we are going to be at the ultimate level of bliss, both mentally and emotionally, but also physically. This is where health happens. This is where our DNA improves and heals. This is where we can shift our disease into wellness. Whereas when we're in this area, we are suffering with health conditions, mental and physical conditions. And that member gets passed on to our families and offsprings, as well as this can pass on to our offspring. So the healing that happens here, we are shifting the generations forward. So our emotions and thoughts affect our cells, and this can be negative thoughts, like we just talked about, negative emotions, and but also our positive emotions. But more specifically, our thoughts. The way we think can affect our DNA. So if we're constantly thinking negative thoughts, we're going to be constantly causing DNA damage. Whereas if we're thinking more positive thoughts, we're going to create much more healing to our DNA, and that's going to shift our generations forward. So I ask you again, do we have the capacity to heal our DNA and our future generations? Does anybody have any comments or thoughts on this now?
Okay.
Well, yes, somebody came on.
And it sounds like in order to, we would have to change our attitude in order to change the DNA so that we don't pass it on to our children. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right.
So
So
we
what's
rise up before we have children.
Well, you know, the problem is also, even after you have children, the stress that you may be facing or going through, they're going to pick that up. So they're going to experience that stress that their parents are going through because of how much parents and children are connected. So ultimately, whether they have been in the womb or preconception or already born, they're going to have the impact of the stress that the parents may be going through. And it's going to affect their DNA as well. So what's fascinating is that approximately 80% of our health is based on epigenetics. In other words, it's based on the switch that we turn on or turn off. And only 20% is based on genes that we inherit. So even if we inherit a gene that has been mutated, we have the capacity to switch it by the experiences and the foods and the environment that we choose to expose ourselves. So what we choose, how we choose to react to the environment around us, how we choose to emotionally react, and how we choose to think to the environment around us, as well as how lifestyle choices, what lifestyle choices we choose can impact the epigenetics. It can impact the way those genes are turned on or off.
It's mainly mental though, isn't it?
A lot of it is mental, but not yet. I'll show you. Dennis, I'll show you. So We have the capacity to control basically our genetic or epigenetic experience. And we don't have to be victims of stress. We don't have to be victims of racism. We don't have to push that forward to the next generations. We can shift it by the way we think positively and act positively, and learn some tools for stress management. So this is one of my favorite quotes, because ultimately we know that love is one of those highest frequencies. And it really is the light that guideth in darkness. So when we are feeling very sick, when we are feeling very closed and incapacitated, we have the capacity to pull ourselves out and just start loving and showing love, not only to ourselves, but to the people and environment around us, in order to pull ourselves out of that deep, heavy frequency. What they have shown is simple techniques of meditation and yoga. They actually have shown that these techniques can transform our epigenetics. So it's not just our thoughts, it's exercises that we do. They have seen that meditation and yoga reduces or slows down the aging process and affects the oxidative stress. For those of you who have not heard me talk about oxidative stress, what oxidative stress is basically the ash that's left behind after a fire. And that ash is more toxic to our cells than the fire is, and to some degree. And so every time there's biochemical changes going on in our body, every time you're digesting food, thinking, going through hormones, stressors, shifts, whatever it may be, exercise, we're producing a lot of oxidative stress. But the deal is that if we can clean up that ash, we're going to slow down the damage to our DNA. And so they're finding that these kind of exercises like meditation and yoga will reduce that ash and slow down the stress response to the cells and the damage that goes on to the cells. And along with, shifting the signaling that happens in the stress, that HPA axis. So here's another study that looked at that specifically, how yoga and meditation slow down the aging at the cellular level. Really interesting studies that we're starting to look at. This is another one that's looking at nutrition and herbal medicine and how that potentially can affect our epigenetics and gene expression. So they looked at a number of different plant-derived substances and how that specifically shifted the epigenetics and modulated the genetic expression of cancer cells and the way our immune system fights cancer. And then this one's looking at nutrition for a very similar reason. So we know now that curcumin, which is the extract of turmeric, resveratrol, which is an extract of grapeseed, sulforaphane, which is an extract of broccoli family of vegetables, and then the tea polyphenols from green tea and black tea, that these have the capacity to directly change that switch, turn it off if it's been mutated, and slow down the aging and reduce the risk for age-related diseases. So specifically, we know that these substances can reduce the risk for heart disease and cancer and shift that genetics so that we don't have to pass it on to our kids. And then they also looked at vitamin D. Remember I was talking about earlier about vitamin D receptors being affected in immigrants and during high stress. And so they are also looking at this study as to how vitamin D actually does also shift the genetics and the genetic expression of the nervous system, your skeletal muscle, metabolic organs like the thyroid, the pancreas, and cancers. And because vitamin D is so involved with so many conditions in our body, anything from bone loss to cancers to even loss of hearing, autoimmune diseases, heart disease, respiratory diseases, nervous system diseases, diabetes, and all of that, that when you modulate the vitamin D receptors and their expression, you're changing the way these are going to be expressing in your body. And then they also looked at vitamin B. And again, vitamin B was one of those that was showing up as a mutation with immigrants and chronic stress. And they looked at how vitamin B status was super important in mothers, preconception, and how that impacts the DNA of their children and their risk for cardiometabolic diseases, which means heart disease and diabetes, insulin resistance type diseases. So they're looking at this specifically at the DNA level. And then they also saw that the changes that happen at the DNA with the vitamin B also affect the telomeres, which is again involved with the aging process at the DNA level. And then you can see this was looking at the B vitamin status and the impact it has on your blood pressure and insulin resistance and DNA in the offspring. So when mother was low in B vitamins before she got pregnant, the children had a higher risk of insulin resistance and blood pressure issues and DNA. And again, keep in mind that we can shift that in the offspring. Well, first of all, feeding the mom properly, but also the offspring, once that baby is born, we can shift these again. And then they also looked at exercise and how exercise can be an epigenetic modification. How many of you knew that exercise can actually shift the epigenetics, can shift the DNA and the DNA methylation, and it can shift the inflammation that happens in the system. It can affect the white blood cells in the system, and it can affect gene expression specifically in certain parts of the brain. You know, and they're showing that physical exercise is an epigenetic modulator of how the brain will function and our memory and learning capacity. So it's amazing. And this is why one of the reasons why exercise as we get older becomes even more vital, because as we get older, that telomere, that aging part of our cells, our DNA, becomes shorter and shorter, and we want to prolong it as much as possible to enhance memory and learning and reduce all the risk for chronic disease. And exercise is one of those very strong ways of doing that. And again, they found that diet and exercise has an impact on generations, specifically type 2 diabetes. So in other words, the diet that we eat and the exercise that we eat specifically affects the offsprings and the grandchildren with the risk for diabetes, and that we can switch that. Ozone is another one that is really powerful. So ozone is 3 oxygen instead of 2 oxygen, which is what we find in air. Air that we breathe is O2, ozone is O3. This is a study, a European study, and you can see it's been revised most recently. You won't find that in English yet. This is all, I believe it's in Spanish, but they looked at how oxygen, ozone, specifically ozone therapy, affects epigenetics and the switches and the genetic expression of diseases and how it impacts oxidative stress. In other words, oxygen therapy and ozone therapy will shift the DNA for the better, not for the worse, for the better. So that is one of the reasons we do so much ozone therapy in our office with anti-aging as well as chronic diseases and even mental health, Alzheimer's, diabetes, heart disease, cancers, because it has the capacity to shift these genetic and epigenetic expressions in our cells and slow down the aging process. So I ask you again, do our emotions and thoughts have the power to heal us? And here's a study. Yes, they do. So here's a study looking at that, how our thoughts are powerful modulators of our mood and genetic expression. So really, if you think about our thoughts are our reality, what we think is our reality. And so it is so important for us to be mindful of our thoughts, mindful of our words, because our words will also affect our children and the people around us, and it will either create a loving environment, or it can create a very stressful environment that will come back and haunt us in a sense, right? And then being mindful of our actions, what we do and how we do it is very important in our lifestyle activities and how we interact with others. And of course, being mindful of our relationships. And that is super important in modifying our epigenetics as well, as these relationships are ultimately the key to gene expression as well. And then spiritual practices play a powerful role in epigenetics. So it really doesn't matter what type of spiritual practice. They have seen over and over again throughout decades that when an individual has spiritual practice of any sort, that their longevity is better, that their quality of life is better, especially in patients who are fighting chronic disease and cancers. So spiritual practices play a huge role because they help us elevate to that ultimate enlightenment and help us push us through.
طلعتي محل انت وياها؟
Sorry, are you making comments? Or let me mute you. Can I mute you? I'm not able to mute you. So these spiritual practices help us elevate to much higher levels of frequencies energetically and emotionally and with our thoughts. So it is really a very, very powerful reality that we need to focus on. And then practicing loving kindness. So loving kindness, they've seen, slows down aging, and it maintains those telomere lengths. Fascinating. So just being kind and loving to others. But in this case, they were looking at loving kindness as a meditation, which is really practicing being loving kindness to ourselves. But it also depends how you are meditating. If you're practicing loving other people during your meditation, that will also affect our aging process and slow it down. So imagine if we're actually practicing it in life and not just in meditation. And this is another study that looked at how by creating a life of joy, love, and pure feelings, purity will shift our DNA for the better. So they looked as to how this impacts our epigenetics and how we have the capacity to control our epigenetics by the things that we think of and the ways we bring joy to our lives and to the lives of others, and how we give service to others and just give to others. All of that, the more we give, the more we serve, it creates a joy, it creates a love, and it creates peace. It pushes us again up to those higher frequencies. And I think more than ever, this COVID-19 in some sense is teaching us that it's not a me, me, me situation. It's really a we situation that we need to bring about wellness and health. Because if you think about the masks, when you're wearing the masks, you're not wearing the mask to protect yourself, because it's not doing anything to protect yourself, but you're wearing the mask to protect others. And what happens is that those others are wearing the mask in order to protect you. And so as a result, we are working at the very we level in order to create health and well-being. And ultimately, the more we take care of others, the more we receive those benefits, even at the genetic level and the epigenetic level. And our generations, our offsprings are at much better space, mentally, physically, and emotionally. So again, do I ask you, do we have the capacity to heal our DNA and our future generations? And I just want to hear a big yes. So this is really powerful. So let us remember that we can change our health through our conscious transformation. It's another beautiful quote that has always stuck with me, is that the potentialities inherent in the station of human, the full measure of his destiny on earth, and the innate excellence of his reality must all be manifested in this day, in this promised day, and that we have the capacity to do that by our thoughts, our activities, our actions, our behaviors. So that is my little presentation on all of this. There's so much to talk about, but I'm going to open this up and have anybody who would like to share anything, any thoughts or comments, please do so. Any questions? Any aha moments?
Actually,
Well, I've got a few chats. I'm looking at these chats and I didn't see these chats, you guys. So thank you so much. Let's see, most of the comments. So then this world causes generational trauma, yes. So but we can also shift that. I'm sorry, Galaxy. I hope you were able to get the volume fixed. I hope you can hear all that. Well, you know, there's a question. If everyone had access to doctors that encourage preventative measures, then this would shift. Well, you know, it takes only one person to start educating others, right? And then you start getting this this repel effect, and so, you know, hopefully we at Holistic have started that, and if we can even put a little seed in one of you and you go and share it with your friends or your other doctors and specialists, they hopefully will get involved and look at some of this stuff, and then they're getting more educated, and it's just gonna have this vibrational effect that just goes out into the whole world. And you know, I think that we are at a point where we're getting very, very close to that critical mass effect. So far, we've had a critical mass effect of negativity throughout generations, but as we gain knowledge, as we have access to the internet and webinars and discussions and intercourse and raise our conversations to more meaningful conversations with others, that we are getting closer to that critical mass that will shift the world to a more positive place. So that is my hope, and that is one of the reasons why we have been engaging in doing these webinars on a weekly basis.
Dr. D, I had a question.
I'm sorry, can you talk a little bit louder, Dennis?
I had a question. If a person had a traumatic experience in the past and it's caused a physical transformation in the way the body works, how do you determine how do you reverse that?
Well, you know, there's been cases where people have been able to reverse some of even neurological conditions resulting from accidents and trauma. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. We actually have a patient that we've been working with that was paralyzed from waist down and is starting to get feeling back in her toes and starting to have some abdominal strength. But it's taken a lot of work. And it takes a lot of work from a team around her, but also that takes a lot of inner work. And she has been working a lot on shifting her mental thought, you know, because when you're in that situation where you've been traumatized, not only are you dealing with the shock of the trauma, but you're also trying to accept what your body is not anymore. And physically, it can be very draining, mentally can be draining, emotionally can be draining, but we can work together to break those cycles and start the healing process. And you know, sometimes the healing doesn't happen at the physical level. Sometimes the need is not at the physical level. Sometimes the individual has to heal at the spiritual and the emotional level, or the thought level. And that is enough to shift them for shifting their future generation. I had a patient many years ago, almost 20 years ago, and she had stage 4 ovarian cancer. She had been fighting stage 4 for 4 years, 5 years, and her kids had taken her to Mexico, pretty much all over the world to get treatment. And she was exhausted, and she came to me and she said, I'm just tired. I don't want to be doing this anymore. I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this anymore. This was her first visit. And so I pulled her to the side away from her family and I said, well, have you told that to your family? And she said, no, she hadn't told that. And it was a heavy weight that was burdening her because she was not, she didn't have the courage or the ability to share those feelings with her family. She thought she would let them down. So we did a little session with her, and she went back and she shared this deeply with her family and was able to let it go, and she passed away a day or two later. But it was so powerful because her children became empowered as a result. And I think it had a dramatic shift on her children. Her daughter was not able to get pregnant, and then when that happened, she was able to get pregnant. So I think things can happen. Healing happens oftentimes at levels that we don't expect it to happen. It can happen at emotional or mental levels, and not necessarily at the physical. Maybe the body, it's time for the body to go, but energetically or emotionally or spiritually or the people around us or our children are not ready to heal yet, and we need to help them heal through healing ourselves at those levels. So everybody's different. Everybody's different, every journey is different. And that's the beauty of why we are all human beings. Okay, any other final thoughts? Anybody? Well, thank you so much for joining me and Holistique. If your friends or family have missed this and they want it to be, I know it's a noon hour is getting harder for more people to come on as everybody's gone back to work, these will be posted on drdarvish.com, and you're welcome to go there and access them, or on my YouTube channel, and should be up by the end of the weekend. Also, every Thursday we're still doing Instagram Live and Facebook Live, and most of those are recorded and either on Instagram or Facebook or drdarvish.com. If any of you have any thoughts for any kind of topics you'd like to discuss, please send us a note. We'll be happy to do a webinar on any of those topics or questions that you may have. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we will see you either tomorrow or next Wednesday at noon.